This will be mainly about Christian churches. Hinduism, some other examples, but I'm going way back to the Parthenon, which was, of course, in ancient Greece, Athena, Athens, arguably the most carefully designed building ever built. In ancient Greek philosophy, beauty wasn't equivalent to truth. Beauty was truth. It was the same thing. And this highly refined building used the golden rectangle, its so-called magical proportions, which are about 5 by 8. It's all over the Parthenon, but it's also in the Piazza San Marco. We'll see later the Mona Lisa, the credit card, the iPod, and our PowerPoint images today. Our eyes can scan the golden rectangle faster than other rectangles, we're told by biologists. Plato said, beauty alone is lovely and visible at once. For mark you, it's the sole aspect of the spiritual, which we can perceive through our senses. So beauty then is the beauty lover's way to the spirit. So there's a spiritual dimension to beauty according to the ancient Greeks. Moving on to the Romans, there's the famous Pantheon, which is all the gods, Pantheon, a famous, the largest dome of its kind when it was built. Some of you have probably been there. It's a remarkable building with a single aperture at the roof, the oculus, which lights the building very dramatically as it rakes the coffers and actually it's it's reinforced concrete. It's unreinforced concrete. A very early example of concrete. This was the largest span built to date, and it's been around about 2,000 years, about since the time that Christ was born in Jerusalem, actually in Bethlehem, nearby. And I know some of you have been on trips with Deutsch to Bethlehem and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. I went there in 1966 when you couldn't even put your head above the wall or it'd be shot off, literally. All right, so the Christian churches of early Europe were called Romanesque. It's an architecture of the Middle Ages early on. It was cruder and heavier with shorter heights and spans than the famous Gothic architecture to follow. It's just plain sort of more stunted in a way. But still, it had the nave and the steeple and so on across. Gothic evolved out of this Romanesque style, and as you know, became extremely sophisticated. A vertical reach to heaven, as the slide on the right shows. The whole idea was that as you went up vertically, it dematerialized. There were more stained glass windows, less stone, and it was meant to be heavenly at the top. It was sort of an upward reach towards heaven. Some of you have been to Chartres in France, a great example of Gothic, not as ornate as this one in Rouen, but still important because it was probably the finest surviving stained glass on the planet, still there, the original. Very interesting, this glass. There are various theories, but if you look at the stained glass in here, when the light shines through it onto the floor or pew or whatever, you can see the color of the glass. Some of these early stained glass windows, for some reason, when the light shines through it, it casts a white shadow, not a colored shadow. It's interesting. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time on Italy because Italy is really the home of, I think, some of the greatest ecclesiastical architecture. They never really embraced the Gothic in Italy. This is Florence. This is actually the church that Michelangelo attended. And as you can see, it's not anywhere near as ornate, although it is ornate, but it doesn't have sort of crenellations and little spires and details that the High Gothic had. And of course, it was in Florence that humanism arose, a more human-centric, secular, and confident worldview than in the Middle Ages, but it was still devoutly Catholic. Florence was rich. It was the bankers to the rest of Europe, and it was really because of that money that they were able to build all the great churches and the great palazzos. Here's an early church in Florence with round arches. It's more abstract, more geometric, stronger color contrast than you find in Gothic. Italian architecture in the Gothic age was more rational, less mysterious. There wasn't this mysterious upward reach to heaven. And there were hints of the Renaissance soon to flower in that great city. So roughly between 1400 and 1550, there was just an explosion of artistic creativity and learning, fueled by new confidence and new wealth. You've all probably been to, if you haven't, you should go to Florence. And this is, of course, the famous cathedral, the famous Campanile on the left, bell tower by Brunelleschi. And the dome was also by him, a great early Italian Renaissance architect. It's a remarkably complex building with double shell dome and lots of interesting side chapels that help sort of support the outward thrust of the dome. All domes want to push out at the bottom, so they have to be contained. There are actually chains around this early dome, which was very large, as you can see, compared to the Pantheon, about the same diameter, although much taller. There were chains and ropes that held it at the base to keep it from essentially exploding outward. And of course, all the flying buttresses were doing the same work in Gothic Cathedral, and these side chapels are also doing their fair share. You can climb up between the two domes to the famous cupola. Well worth it. It's actually not that scary to do that. It gets a little hairier at the top because you're leaning over more. But it's a great church and a great city. Here's a little detail. This is a window in medieval Florence that was used during the plague, probably to take confession. I'm not sure. Here she is serving wine during the recent COVID pandemic. So the Renaissance wanted to perfect churches. This is Montepulciano, not far away. It has bilateral symmetry. You draw a line through it. North, south, east, west, they're the same. It's a circular plan. It's sort of reaching for that Renaissance perfection. Inside, it's much lighter, more rational. It's totally clear, unlike the Gothic cathedrals. It's symmetrical. It doesn't have the dim light, the mystery, and the asymmetry of Northern Europe. It's different on this side of the Alps. Climate, terrain, and vegetation were underlying shapers of aesthetic sensibility. There are books about how the Italian landscape was fundamentally different than, say, the German or Scandinavian landscape, and how it affected architecture. Here's a great quote from a friend of mine. In Italy, for 30 years, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed during the Renaissance. Yet they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. And in Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace. What did they produce? Exactly. So 1500 or so, the Renaissance migrated down from Florence to Rome, and it's the famous Noli map. showing all the streets and squares and piazzas, as well as the interior of all the churches, which were public. So they were drawn in as public space, although covered, unlike the streets and piazzas. There's the famous upper left's the famous Piazza Navona, the Tiber River lower left, and so on and so forth. Here is the Piazza Navona. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. There's a famous Bernini church, or Borromini church, I can't remember, and a fountain. One's by Borromini, one's by Bernini. Very famous fountain. And a beautiful piazza, very heavily peopled. Here you can see the base of that famous Navona sculpture. It's one of the best public squares ever, according to National Geographic. You see the guy on the left with his hand reaching up. That is Bernini's statue reeling back in disgust from Borromini's church facade. These were dueling rock stars from two generations of the Baroque era. I mean, the architects were household names. They were rock stars. And of course, Rome and all these great Italian cities are full of these piazzas. Here's one nearby, not far from the Parthenon. They're really just sort of outdoor rooms, usually a little longer than they are wide and closed on 3 or 4 sides with active edges. The facades they rhyme with each other, but they're not identical. They really hold together very nicely. Then, of course, we have St. Peter's in Rome, not so near the historic center, across the Tiber. This is the plan. This is the dome. That's called the Baldacchino in the foreground there. That's basically a structure. This is 80 feet high. It's the structure that houses and loosely houses the altar. And there's the dome by Michelangelo, who also did these incredible pilasters, they're called, on the outside. Those are those flattened columns with the Corinthian capitals and the base and so on. These were done by Michelangelo, and it's much bigger than it looks. That square open window at the top is huge if you compare it to the cars down below. You could drive a truck through one of those holes. The scale was immense. The dome, beautifully designed by Michelangelo. Michelangelo was the one guy that could basically thumb his nose at the Pope. The Pope would write him a note and say, hey, come back to Rome, don't go back to Florence, and he would just ignore him. But he's the only guy that could get away with that because the Pope knew he was a genius. You've been to the Sistine Chapel, no doubt, if you've been to the Vatican. He spent 2 years, was it? 2 years or 4 years on his back painting that roof, that ceiling. And they say when he came down after months up there and they would help him take off his leather shoes, the soles of the shoes would take the soles of his feet with them. And it was that, because he just lived up there and was taking food up there and so on. He was a little, what are you saying? That's a good question. He probably had a bucket. He spent a long time up there. And when he painted behind us is the what is it? The big painting on the wall right behind us on the left. It's called the Last Supper, is it now? The Last Judgment. In the lower right-hand corner, that's a picture of Michelangelo on the lower right, on the right side. A short, rather ugly little guy. That was his signature. Well, Rome quickly turned Baroque, which is grander. I mean, actually, St. Peter's Basilica. It's not the Cathedral of Rome, it's a basilica. And of course, the Vatican's in the upper right there. It's the seat of Catholicism. It's the great piazza out front with the famous obelisk in the middle. I think it's from Egypt, and the oval piazza, and so on and so forth. Here, if you were to stand up on the roof and look out, that's the access out to the Tiber River, which actually Mussolini cleared out. It was originally filled in, and there's, well, you can see the roof, the church, and the elliptical plaza, etc. The Vatican post office is over on the right, which is where a lot of people mail their microphone, please. The Vatican post office is on the right, where a lot of people mail their postage because it's much more timely than the Italian. The popes, especially Sixtus V, connected the city with these amazing axes. They cleared out parts of the city to have these straight axes. In this case, on the upper right. I'm sorry, so at the top. Let's see if this works. I think what's at the Piazza del Popolo. There are these three axes that go way out into the city, and there are other axes in the city, including this one. UW has a Rome program that's centered right here and right here. And my wife and others in this room have walked up and down that street towards the Vatican. And this is where the one Jewish synagogue is. I'll show you in a minute. Anyway, the Great Walled City, the Vatican is an independent country, as you know, one of the smallest. So they were really into symmetry. This is a church not far at all from the Piazza Navona, which has always blown my architectural mind. So here's the entrance, and this is a chapel off the left, a large chapel. And they want to be symmetrical. So they build this over here that looks the same. You can't see it all, but this is identical to that, except there's a street through it there. You know, they were not bothered by that. It takes a Republic passage to fulfill its symmetry. If you've ever been to San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, that is San Carlo with the four fountains at this famous intersection, very late Baroque. It's really getting to what's called Rococo. Here's a plan. You go into a traditional entrance and courtyard, sort of rectilinear, but then you come into this church that's uses ellipses and elliptical domes in a radical new way. It's very sort of voluptuous, and it's very small, but well worth a visit. The dome is amazing, as you can see that. This dome or vault is not a vault. This is actually a flat ceiling. But the Italians became so good at painting trompe l'oeil that they could make a flat ceiling look like it was vaulted. It's an amazing painting by Andrea Pozzi in the late Baroque. Now we'll go up north to Venice. Many of you have been there, the famous Piazza San Marco, St. Mark's, dramatically located right next to the water where big cruise ships come in, and what is one of the most remarkable cities in the world with all those little medieval passageways and bridges over canals, no roads, no cars. Amazing place. This is St. Mark's itself, the cathedral at the end, which is sort of Byzantine in style, very ornate, with a simple tower built about 1900, a rebuilt in 1900, which is, you know, very Renaissance compared to the Byzantine ornateness of the church. And then that's the Ducal Palace on the right, between the tower and the building on the far right, which is where the Duke, or the head of the Republic, it was the Republic that ruled Venice and its many colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Remarkably successful. Um, Inside that church, it's dark and mysterious. Very ornate carvings on the roof. And of course, as we know, flooding, despite big gates being built not far from the city, plagues St. Mark's and much of Venice. Now, I don't know what's going to happen to Venice, but it's such an important place. I don't know, they'll build bigger dikes or who knows what, but I don't think the world will let it be destroyed. Milan, a little to the west, has an amazing cathedral shown here, part of which is shown. It was the commercial capital, and still is, of Italy, and there's some great, relatively Gothic architecture, but not as much, obviously, as Rome, Florence, and Venice. Ukraine's been in the news a lot. My wife and I have had the pleasure of going to Lviv and Kiev and other places. And these are the beautiful dome churches in Kiev, which have not been hit by the bombs. Not too far away from Lviv in Poland, it's Krakow, an amazing medieval city, one of the most beautiful in Poland. And it's, of course, not far from Auschwitz and Birkenau. But this is a church looking up at the ceiling of a church in Krakow. Astounding, just astounding. And of course, if you go northeast, you get the Moscow. This is the St. Basil's in the Kremlin with its ornate domes, onion domes. Incredible. So my wife and I have been going for the last 4 or 5 years to San Miguel, Mexico. And this is the main church in San Miguel. It's very ornate, very famous, done by a non-architect, sort of fantasy. This is obviously the back of the main spire and the town square right across it. There are a lot of Catholic parades and festivities that go on. This is right in front of the parochia, as it's called, which is not the cathedral because there's no bishop here, but it's a big church. And here you can see some Aztecs dancing, which reminds you that the Aztec religion goes back much further in Mexico, much further than Catholicism. And these are incredible outfits and dances to drum beats they do right across from this is the main square. We have some friends who live there from Kansas City, one of whom, a worker who works for them, sort of maintaining their compound, personally built this chapel. It's a tiny little chapel, incredibly ornate. Most of that gold is just paper mache, but nonetheless, this was done by a single craftsman working for years in our friend's compound. Incredible. So moving into the modern era, probably no church is more famous than Le Corbusier's Longchamp Chapel. Very radical, to say the least, in its day. A sort of world famous pilgrimage site. An incredible sort of floating roof, amazing windows with remarkable light. He was a real poet. And this is one of his masterpieces. Here's his front door. Did incredible color enamel doors on his churches and other buildings he did. Now, another great architect is Stephen Hall, who went to the University of Washington. And you should go visit his chapel at Seattle U. It's right off Madison. It's well worth a visit. It's an extraordinary building. As you can see here, the interior is complex and again with lighting, a little bit like Le Corbusier. It's a very dramatic, very unusual space. Much more than our nave, which is beautiful, with the nice stained glass windows and pews and so on and so forth. Is that Deutsch standing up there? Now notice the coffers in the ceiling. How at the back they're smaller. That's to increase or heighten the sense of perspective, to make the nave look longer than it is. This is a common optical trick done in naves to make them look longer or bigger or whatever. It's a beautifully constructed building. We're very lucky to have it. And Dwight and his staff put on such great events. So, oh, by the way, when we're in San Miguel, Mexico, I go to a Episcopal church down there, Americans primarily, and very good sermons, not as good as Dwight's, but it's a pleasure every Sunday to keep going when we're gone approximately 2 months a year. This is a picture in Orvieto, a town north of Rome. It's church, and it emphasizes something that a famous professor, now retired at UW, Grant Hildebrand, wrote several books about. He wrote a lot about refuge, prospect, enticement, and a little bit of hazard. So here we have refuge. We're sort of in this darkened space. We can see out the prospect. We're enticed by it. I don't know what the hazard or peril is here. Maybe you don't know what's around the corner, but it forms a complex order that makes us feel alive and appeals to our senses as comfortable, interesting, attractive, and beautiful. He's written a lot about how we develop these inclinations while we evolved on the edge of the savannah in East Africa for millions of years. We learned to love dapple light because we looked at the savannah for prey, either prey that could kill us or that we could kill and consume. And so we spent a lot of time under dappled light, and people just love dappled light. You may not realize it, but next time you're in dappled light, you'll realize how wonderful it feels. Views of nature, just pictures of them on a hospital wall, make you not only feel better, they actually make you heal faster. We reach for attractive objects. Beauty literally moves us. Now, going to the Alhambra and switching to Muslim architecture and religion, this biophilic design, which is what Grant Hildebrand and others have described. This is a crude, sort of, not crude, it's very sophisticated, but it's meant to be the sort of light in the forest clearing. When we're in the forest, we're attracted to openings where there's light, and we're drawn to them, which I think you can sense. Let's talk about mosques, synagogue, and Buddhist temples. Here's the Dome of the Rock. If you've been to Jerusalem, this is one of the very first, maybe the first mosque, probably is. From which one? Muhammad ascended to heaven, I think. It's quite near the dome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, up on the hill. Remember, Jerusalem's got Judaism, Christianity, and Islam there. It's quite a remarkable city. Now back to Spain, the Alhambra, aesthetics, beauty, the ineffable, the sublime, the elusive. It's taken to very high level in this complex, this palace with its many courtyards and pools and fountains and so on. Very subtle, elegant Moorish abstractions, in this case of trees and their leaves, sort of a forest of light, or it's like forest light. Architecture has been described as frozen music. This could be a Bach composition, I think. Just remarkable detail, both two-dimensional and three-dimensional, that resonate with us. The scene is beautiful by all religions, obviously. Incredible domes, niches, remarkable biophilic form. This is in Esfahan, in Iran. Here's a mosque my wife and I visited in Morocco, a very tall minaret. A beautiful building right on the water. Here's that one synagogue I said I'd include. It's one in Rome. I don't know so much about synagogue design, but it's generally centroidal without the axis of a nave. And then, of course, temples all over the world. This one happens to be in China. This is in Bangkok, a floating temple. The Buddhas are amazing. It's a very large one we saw in, I don't know, Myanmar, I think it was. And here, a whole complex of these incredible stupas, as they're called, which are more or less tombs, plated in gold. This is in the city. Gone. Incredible. And there are pilgrims walking around these prayers, kneeling, and so on. Here's an amazing one covered by a tree and roots in, this was, I believe, Myanmar. Where was this? Cambodia. Astounding buildings. Some of you have been to Japan. It's a Shinto temple, probably. I think this is the ones in Kyoto. This is actually in Tokyo, but very different architecture. Lots of orangey red color, and it's Shintoism is sort of religion, sort of a philosophy. I was a member of a Buddhist group in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I lived with my wife for 21 years before moving back here about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And this was for a ceremony in honor of the so-called guru that I studied under, Gaelic Rinpoche. I was very lucky. He was probably number 2 after the Dalai Lama in the Tibetan Buddhist hierarchy, and he happened to be in Ann Arbor. So I'd go there on Sunday and listen to his amazingly erudite and impressive, revealing talks. There are Buddhist temples here in Seattle, but none with the likes of Gaelic Rinpoche. There's one about 3/8 of a mile from here, Shambhala. This is a tanka, which is a sort of personal prayer wheel. It's a painting my wife gave me, hand painted in Nepal. And sometimes I meditate in front of it. I hit a little bowl and it rings and so on. So you wonder, how can I be a Buddhist and a Christian? Well, there's no problem whatsoever. There are no gods in Buddhism, no deities. So it's a philosophy, it's a way of life, and there were many members of the Jewish, very large Jewish group in Ann Arbor, where people would come for retreats from all over the country and even from other countries to listen to Gaelic Rinpoche. And I asked him once, is there an issue? He said, no, absolutely no issue. You can be a Christian and a Buddhist at the same time. So I try to do both. I do a little meditation each morning. I includes prayers as well. So I took 2 years off after being dean at the University of Michigan for the School of Architecture and Planning. And I worked in Dubai. My wife came and I was the vice president of design at a very large development firm doing projects in Europe, all over Asia, and parts of Africa. And believe it or not, I got to design a mosque personally. This is a very rare privilege for a non-Muslim. A little bit about Dubai. It's a crazy city. High-rise mania. There it is in the Gulf of, well, it's called the Persian Gulf by us. I forget, they call it something else. Anyway, it's the red country, and Dubai is about in the middle, which is Abu Dhabi. Anyway, amazing city being constantly built. These high rises are being built 24/7 by these poor Pakistani Muslims who come over to do labor and live in labor camps that are underpaid and so on. Rather tragic. Tens of thousands of them. And these go on, these are being built by wealthy investors from all over the Muslim world, most of whom will never, ever occupy a unit. It's just a safe investment because banks are not so dependable in the Middle East. So these towers are essentially savings accounts. They're very progressive. The Dubai ruler is an amazing guy, and they want to start printing all their new buildings by 2030. You know, that building on the right there, upper right, the printed building. Or these other two, but well, this proposed train station wouldn't be printed. But you can see they love exotic, dramatic modernism. So this mosque I got to design was at the end of a metro. And by the way, I was allowed to come to the meetings at the Bureau of Islamic Affairs that reviewed the design. Until the very last meeting, I wasn't allowed to come to that. But this is the main drag that goes down to Abu Dhabi from Dubai. But Abu Dhabi is about an hour and a half to the south. And this is the last stop in the metro, which has been built. It's an elevated line. And our company was developing this long rectangular site. And they'd already built these buildings over here. And there's a park. And I said, and here's where we proposed the mosque. And first, we tried a Muslim from Africa. We didn't like his design. The leader of the company, Saeed, was a brilliant little guy, about 5'4", who was the world chess champ when he was 14, 15, and 16 years old. Brilliant guy, a nice guy. And then we tried a famous Muslim architect from London, and we didn't like that. And so I said, why don't you let me design it? Okay. So here's the building that I designed, and these are actually built here. Oh, you don't see that little pointer? Oh, darn, I'm very sorry. It shows up on my screen. All right, so that's the mosque. These are buildings we'd already built. These are buildings we're going to build in the future. That's the end of the metro. You can see a tunnel in there and a bridge over there. If you're nice. So let me just go back since I haven't been pointing. Well, you'd understand this. All right. So we're getting closer to it. There's the minaret. There's the roof, which is covered with solar collectors. This is where the imam lives. The imam always lives, unlike Joy or a minister. The imam actually lives in the building. And this is the prayer hall, which you'll see, very radical. So this is the front of the building, and it always faces Mecca. That's the only literal thing, and the only symbol, the half moon, which is basic to Islamic thought because, the whole lunar calendar is what drives their prayer cycle. The women come in over here. Women always have a separate entrance. The men come in here. They do ablutions. They wash up before going into the prayer hall. The imam's behind here. Lives behind there. Here we are down at eye level. That's where the imam lives. This is the prayer hall with a moat around it. This was a very radical prayer hall. They're always enclosed. People bow down and pray. Next to yellow, whether you're rich, poor, the order in which you arrive, you just sit next, next to the person in the front row, in the late, the most recent row. And I actually, now this wasn't built, but someday I hope it will be. I actually did a glass prayer hall, but it had very intricate screens that you could slide back and forth that have different patterns made out of, with circular cutouts, folded circles, and concave and so on and so forth to give it a really rich privacy. This is where the imam would be and give his sort of some center. And there was a reed bed I showed you around the prayer hall. That was to clean and recycle water used for the prayer ablutions. People would come, they do go 5 times a day. When we were having a meeting at the office, the bell would ring and all the Muslims would go down to the ground floor and pray for 10 minutes without fail. Anyway, this water could be used for irrigation, the reflecting pool, and for toilets. Here's a dramatic picture of it. You can see the minaret, the roof, for the uplight. There's the sort of glowing prayer hall on the right, and so on. That's my final slide. Alas, this hasn't been built yet, but I'm hoping it will be. Thank you. And I would love to take questions. Yes, over here. Oh, there's wax on walls. I didn't know that. I'm sorry, I didn't notice the aroma either. Oh, in the small chapel. Oh, yeah. What's that? Yeah, Linda Beaumont married a good friend of ours. Yeah, it's a remarkable place. Worth a visit. It's now open. It was closed for a long time. I saw another hand over there. How about another question? How are we doing on time? Oh, it's early. Yes. Oh, most of those Muslim, almost all of them are tiles. Both on the inside and outside of the building, the interior and exterior surfaces are tiles. They got very sophisticated with mosaics in the Islamic world. You also see that in Venice and parts of Italy. Well, mosaics all over the world, but nothing like, say, Isfahan, capital of ancient Rome. Yes.
Is that structure, both like the visual desire, but as well as a structural?
No, I think it was because the colors last forever. It's just a very permanent way to do murals and images and patterns. They're abstract patterns. Notice in the Muslim church, there are never pictures of people. We have pictures of Christ. We have in Mexico, these crucifixes and so on. That would never happen in a Muslim church. It's all abstracted. Nothing pictorial. Yes. It's awaiting a donor. The timeline for that month. Who knows? It's pretty radical. It may never get built. Every mosque in the United Arab Emirates, of which Dubai is the major city, is funded usually by a single donor. And this would take a very unusual donor. It's a radical building. But my fingers are crossed. Yes, ma'am.
Church, the Vatican II. The experience of the congregation.
I don't know a lot about Vatican II, but you mean the processional at the beginning? Maybe you could elaborate. What do you think?
Well, they're laid out differently. Or like an auditorium.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, many of them are like auditorium now. You're absolutely right. Yeah, and those big giant churches in like LA and so on. Fundamentalist, just giant auditorium. Why are you laughing?
Well, just because some churches these days are so simple and they lose the ornateness and beauty of the people. Some of the beauty when you first listen.
Right, well, what do you think of our nave and church? Yeah, it's not ornate, but it's certainly interesting to the eye. There's a lot to look at. I never get bored looking around. And even Ronchamp, that Le Corbusier chapel I showed you, had a lot of variety inside. But you're right, modernism tended to simplify.